Hello, I'm Dror Feitelson, and I'm going to present our research on using non-verbal expressions as a tool in naming research. So it's widely accepted that names are important in computer source code. For one thing, they constitute a large fraction of the source code. But more importantly, they convey the meaning of the code. In a sense, we can say that names form a channel of communication between the developer who wrote the code and the future maintainers who need to read and understand it. So it's really interesting to study how are names created. How do people choose names for variables and functions? And we can envision this following experiment to study this question. First, we describe a programming need. Then we ask experimental subjects to write a program that addresses this need. And then we analyze the names that they give in the program they write. But there's a problem, because the descriptions of the problem necessarily use words. And these words are read by the experimental subjects and they become more accessible to them. And as a result, the subjects will tend to use these words in the name that they create. In cognitive research, this is known as the accessibility bias. So in previous work, we suggested the following approach to try to alleviate this problem. What we did was we gave the descriptions in Hebrew. And this indeed led to considerable reduction in the bias. However, this limits the experiments to subjects who know Hebrew or some other foreign language. The new idea I want to suggest is to use emojis. We replace keywords in the description with emojis, which are also universal language, but not English. And the question is, will this also reduce the accessibility bias? So here's an example of how we do the translation. For example, the description could talk about a large chewing gum company where workers have a certain wages. And first thing that we do is we identify keywords that might find a way into named variables, and we change these keywords into emojis. In some cases, this is direct. For example, workers turn into this emoji here, and hourly wages is turned into money and clock. In some other cases, we don't have a good translation. For example, we didn't find a good emoji for chewing gum, so we changed this into a candy company. The same also happens with more involved or more complicated keywords. For example, we want to talk about overtime and full-time positions. So when we talk about encouraging employees to work overtime, we just say to do more instead of trying to express this as an emoji. And also, a full-time position is just translated into a worker usually does so and so many hours. So after we do all of these translations into emojis, we get something like this scenario. This scenario talks about a candy company where workers have a certain wages. And due to high demand, the company wants them to encourage them to work overtime. And the task for the experimental subjects is to give two names. One name is for the constant containing the value 45, which is the normal working hours per week. And the second name is for the variable of the wages during overtime. So we conducted this experiment and we get lots of different names and these are names for the constant 45, including things like normal hours per week or hours per week or weekly work hours or regular work hours in week or basic work time or overtime threshold and so on. And we want to analyze them. So first thing, we analyze the concepts in these names. And as I show, each name is usually composed of multiple words, and these words represent different concepts. And what we find are that there are concepts which tend to appear when we give a verbal description, like in English and Hebrew, but do not appear when we use emojis. For example, the notion of this being a full time and that there is a threshold. There are other concepts, on the other hand, which appear much more when we use emojis than when we use verbal descriptions. For example, the fact that this is a regular or a normal working week. But we're more interested in the accessibility bias. So in order to measure the accessibility bias, we define the matrix of focus and diversity. Focus is the concentration of names, and it's measured by the fraction of responses giving the most popular name. And diversity measures the distribution of names. It's measured by the number of different names relative to the total number of responses we received. And in this specific research, we're not interested in so much in the focus and diversity of the full names, but of the words which represent the different concepts. So here are the results of focus and diversity of words and the different that represent the different concepts in all the different questions in our experiment in all different scenarios. And what we see here are cumulative distribution functions that show our results in this experiment with emojis and compare them with the results from the original experiment using English or Hebrew descriptions. And what we see is in the top graph is that the diversity tends to be lower when we use English descriptions. For example, here we see that in nearly 80% of the cases, the diversity was less than 15% when we used English descriptions. But when we used Hebrew or emojis, the diversity tended to be higher. When you look at the focus, on the other hand, when using English descriptions, in more than half of the cases, the focus was very high. More than 90% of the names of the words actually were the same most popular word. And when we use Hebrew or emojis, the focus tends to be lower. Importantly, what we see here is that using emojis leads to similar results as using Hebrew. So the conclusions are that using emojis is indeed effective in reducing the accessibility bias. And moreover, when looking at the names themselves, we see that the results display a focus diversity dichotomy. There are few cases where there's high focus and low diversity. These are clear situations with evident naming. But the more interesting cases are the ones where we have low focus and high diversity, because these apparently are somewhat more ambiguous and require some nuanced naming. And this is what we would like to study further. And our results indicate that emojis can help in these studies. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Dror, for the presentation again. Again, super interesting work. I do have a question for you. So you did study variable names, and I was wondering if you think that it's worth also pushing this into other entities. So, for example, method names, if you think that can be beneficial, and if yes, do you think how much of the results do you expect to see this on different type of entities?
So actually, in some of our experiments, we also looked at function names, not only variable names. We focused on variable names because there were more variable names, and so there was more data to work with, and we didn't analyze function names separately so much. But basically, the same things apply. So it's not really different. We didn't check bigger elements like classes and stuff like that, but. So I think in classes it could be a bit different because you need to sort of put more effort into really naming them well, but I don't know, we didn't check that.
Okay, there is a question from Fernando in the chat. So he's saying, great work. Are there obvious cases you envision where emojis would not be useful?
I don't know if obvious, but I mean, even in our paper, there was one case when we made a mistake and we used a not really good emoji, and it became too dominant, and so people, it was a diamond which was meant to reflect bonus points you get for using a credit card, and people just all called it diamonds instead of bonus points or stuff like that. So it's sort of the emoji sort of took over the whole issue, the whole thing, which was obviously wrong. But that's not a situation. That's we did not choose a good emoji. We did not translate it in a good way. I don't know if there are, I mean, I don't really expect emojis to solve world hunger and every problem, but so maybe there are cases where it's not good, but in this small specific case, I think it worked fine.
And maybe a very quick question: if you can talk about the, how the specificity of the description plays a role here, or depending on how general it is or how specific it is.
I don't know. That's not a small question. That's sort of the main issue there is how wide you are or how